everyone. Welcome to IA Talks Innovation. Now, well, you've already heard Nikkei on our first episode on tokenization, and that's been extremely exciting. We're now here for part 2 of FCA's consultation paper on Direct2Fund. It's me, Shruti, your usual host, joined by the head of innovation unit at the IA, John Allen. Over to you, John. What's Direct2Fund? Tell us what we're going to talk about today.
So the best people to ask about Direct2Fund are the industry leaders who've been informing our work on this over the past few years and came up with the industry's proposals of how this could potentially work. So delighted that also today we've been joined by Michael McNeil, who's led the Direct2Fund working group, and also Jane Thornton, who has commandeered a number of legal firms to help us out with the potential ways in which direct dealing could be implemented within the UK funds industry. So first of all, let's hear from them about what Direct2Fund actually is.
This really is a day of thanks and, dare I say it, a little bit of celebration today. We're certainly really excited to be here after the years that John was referring to, that this initiative's been going on. And I would also just want to comment and thank all the contributors to this initiative. It really has been a multi-year piece of work, and there's too many people to sort of list here, but yeah, the key contributors, you know who you are, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for your contribution, which has been essential. So as John alluded to, the UK, by accident history or reason that maybe is better explained by somebody else, early on adopted an investor model for collectives where the fund manager would act as a principal to a transaction. And through this form of acting as principal, that gives rise to the fund manager handling client money. And then, of course, that requires a number of systems and controls to segregate that client money, protect that client money. And we all know that CAS is the regime, the regulatory regime we work under. From all our sort of head scratching and conversations over the years, we haven't really found another domicile that operates this. So, you know, it seems to be unique to the UK, possibly because of a historical anomaly we talked about. So really, again, just for those that are maybe not come across this has been looked at as far back as 2016. The IA and its membership started to imagine and what could be an alternative here, and why should we just have this one option of investor dealing? Is there other initiatives? And ultimately, in 2017, a sort of formal programme of work which became known as Direct2Fund, what was born out. Then what followed was really a multi-year programme to propose the alternative model, which we'll go through later today. And through, you know, lots and lots of scenario analysis, lots of stress testing, a deep legal and regulatory review, and lots and lots of engagement with industry, FCA, platforms, transfer agents, auditors, depository, treasury and government, you know, a big long list. We find ourselves where we are today, which is in a really good place. And I guess the first thing that is that it's an incredibly simple model, and actually for a lot of people also be incredibly familiar, because essentially we're trying to create an environment that compares and has parity with the competitors. The AFM will no longer act as a counterparty, so essentially we're removing the fund management company as a credit risk to the investor. The next is the IEC account. In case anybody's interested, IEC stands for Issue and Cancellation Account. I had to look that up the other day. Couldn't remember. Is part of the scheme property, and so that means, and just to underline that point, that any cash or balance within that is the property of the fund and belongs to the fund, not to the individual investor. So it's not a client money account in disguise. The IC can, again, this is a sort of practical perspective, the IC can be operated as a single account for the umbrella, so multiple sub-funds can utilise it, or there's no reason why, if a fund manager or transfer agent chose to, no reason why they couldn't have multiple accounts if that was a preferred model. Next point, again, is just an operational one, but it's worth calling out. The IEC doesn't need to be an account with the custodian bank. So So, that can happen, but the model has no preference to who the banker is that operates the IEC account. So if people wanted to potentially repurpose their existing collection accounts, that's entirely possible. Or, of course, they could put it within the custody network if they chose. And then the last thing is that, again, maybe an obvious point, but I'll make it anyway, that everything, the IC account falls within the full regulatory framework that any other assets of the fund fall into. So, all those protections and controls and reconciliations that happen many, many times every day for a fund will extend to this account as well. What this model does is it really aligns the UK against what is essentially a global norm and a really successful operating model in other jurisdictions, removing the risk of loss that the investor bears today against the AIFM. As we know, the client money rules, the cash rules, go a long way to mitigating that risk, but they can't remove that risk. So, we're taking that risk, or Direct2Fund takes that risk off the table, essentially. And really the last thing is why do all these things? It's really about competitiveness, about the UK. That for me, another driving force when we looked at this back in 2017, 2018, we were really looking at it as a barrier to doing business in the UK and an anti-competitive issue that we were trying to solve for. So by introducing this alternative model, we've created that parity of the competitive landscape, and that's obviously a positive and continues to be a positive and make the UK, it's obviously a very attractive place to do business already, but it just does its bit to make it even more attractive to foreign fund managers and investors alike.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jane Thornton. There has been a lot of groundwork carried out by various IA groups. The initial meetings focused on what the model would look like and how it would work in practice. From an operational perspective, there was a clear desire to seek to remain as consistent as possible with the current operational standards that apply in relation to fund dealing. We were not seeking to try to move radically away operationally from how things are done today. There was detailed scenario analysis undertaken to look at what would happen and test the model in a whole range of different scenarios. Things like what happens if there's late payment, what happens if someone pays into the wrong account or pays the wrong amount. And all of those scenarios were worked through in some detail to confirm that the model would work and could be handled. And over time, there has been further work done on fund accounting implications, etc. On the legal side, we established a legal working group with participation from several of the leading law firms who do work in this sector. And personally, it's been a real privilege to chair that group, be involved in such a collaborative exercise to look at the detail of the legal and regulatory implications, which is what we did in terms of the work there. We started with an initial high-level feasibility study and concluded that there were no sort of fundamental impediments as to why one couldn't devise a D2F model. But then we did a really in-depth legal and regulatory analysis of FCA's rules, in particular in CAS and in COL. And throughout the process, we've engaged with FCA along the way. We must have had 3 or 4 meetings with them, and we have produced some fairly detailed analysis for them to consider of the ways in which this model could be implemented.
So now let's hear from Nike at FCA about the FCA's rule changes in relation to Direct2Fund and the consultation questions that the FCA would like industry's input on.
So we're taking forward a number of rule changes to facilitate Direct2Fund, really with a view to facilitating innovation. But it's something that we've been working on with industry for some time. We're hugely grateful for all the input we've had. We also think these changes come at a really timely point in time as firms think through what other operating changes they might make in relation to T+1. And so it's a great opportunity to think through how your operations work. In terms of actual changes we've made, there are some things we've introduced in the handbook that might sound really dry, but really to introduce key terms like direct dealing schemes and to really make clear in the handbook that Direct2Fund is optional. Firms remaining on the box model shouldn't need to update instruments or look at lots of new rules right now, but if they want to, they can, and they can also transition. Second part of rule change is to introduce scheme-level collection account. We've introduced the IAC, the issues and cancellation account, which can be used at an umbrella level where appropriate, or individual IACs at sub-fund level. Both of those are catered for in the rules. So we need to ensure that this doesn't result in more than a hypothetical risk to investors, for example, those arising through defaults of sub-fund, if they wish to use an umbrella structure. Third part here are consequential changes. The IAC is now scheme property and cash that belongs to the fund. It needs to be considered in risks and spread controls of the fund. We also agree that unattributed sums in the IAC shouldn't be part of the NAV, but that fund managers should understand what is going into the NAV today to ensure it's accurate. Finally, as part of the Direct2Fund model, we've taken a look at how firms deal with other cash flows, and we're working and will continue to work with you at the IA on how funds can better deal with things like small sums that are inefficient, too costly to be distributed.
What is the FCA's view of the industry's proposals? And are there any areas of divergence where you haven't accepted what the industry has suggested?
We know industries put a huge amount of work into Direct2Fund, including consideration of investor protection, which is obviously very important to us. It's fair to say that one of the aims of Direct2Fund is that on a day-to-day basis, it's invisible from an investor perspective, that it really creates operational efficiency behind the scenes. So we're proposing that the responsibility of the fund manager to own the investor relationship does not change. If an investor pays in late and the manager opts not to cancel that deal, firms will need to bear the interest costs. Equally, don't expect to see overdrafts on IAC or an asset of one sub-fund being used to cover liabilities of another.
Thanks, Nike. Clearly, the FCA has thought about quite a few operational areas for Direct2Fund. It would be good to get your views on the importance of prompt reconciliations and, most importantly, investor protection outside of the CAS framework.
Yeah, that's really important. Under Direct2Fund, cash becomes a business-as-usual deal flow between fund and investor, from one principal to another, without the firm and its balance sheet in the middle. This means there's no client money in a structural way. However, to us, that does not mean that client money protections are in substance disapplied. So the manager must promptly identify individual payments and attribute them to a specific sub-fund. When sums cannot be attributed, these must be returned to the sender and moved to a client money account maintained by the manager. By close of business following receipt, we expect the operation and governance controls here to be strong, and then procedures remain consistent with those for client money reconciliations to really avoid that contagion risk and ensure valuation accuracy.
And are there any implications for the role of the depository, given that the AFM is no longer a party to the unit creations?
So we think the depository continues to play a really important role, at least in the context of authorized funds. It's a really critical component of our investor protection regime. We think oversight of unit dealing as one of the 5 duties delivers value when depository is overseeing, monitoring the manager rather than doing the reconciliation. It's an important independent second check. It becomes more complex for schemes without legal personality, particularly for trust, where the depository is a trustee. But nevertheless, we think it's really important. We are considering amendments to our rules to allow the manager to issue and cancel units in AUTs and ACSs, consistent with how fund managers have responsibility for trust register today. And we also want to make sure that the manager's role in relation to investors, including AML controls, remains the same. We're working with you and other parties on how Direct2Fund, regardless of what structure it's used for, should be interpreted under money laundering regulations. We don't own these, but in the meantime, firms will need to take their own legal analysis for schemes in relation to how they operate based on arrangements they have in place and our proposed rules for Direct2Fund.
Thanks, Nike. That's a lot of rule changes, lots of forward thinking around Direct2Fund, and that directly supports some of the work on tokenization, of course. You've chosen as the FCA to include all of these rule changes as part of the broader document on tokenization. We were just wondering what is sort of the link between the two, if we could lay it out for firms. And do firms have to do both of these things together, or what's your thinking behind that?
The reason we thought about Direct2Fund in the context of tokenization is when firms innovate, they're not just going to innovate on the basis of the status quo. They're going to want to evolve. And that's why Direct2Fund becomes a really powerful facilitator as firms are thinking through innovation. But absolutely, firms are not obliged to take forward Direct2Fund model. It's possible to maintain the current box model. It's possible to set up a new fund under Direct2Fund and maintain your other ones under the box model. It's possible to convert a fund over time if that's what you want to do. But we really want to create choice in the rulebook here.
So this is a really great moment for the funds industry and the work that the IA has been doing with members over a number of years in formalising these proposals. So we now have the opportunity to feed into the FCA's work on this. Before the rules come into effect. We'd love to hear from members who would be interested in taking forward the model, or indeed anyone who's read the proposals and would like to provide their input.
Thank you so much, John. It's clearly a lot of thinking outside the box model. And thank you all for listening in. Please do reach out to the IA. That it is a very short 5-week timeline to respond to the FCA. We will be responding to this most definitely and get involved with our IF3 lab.